Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West on this dark day in the nation's capital as the aftermath of the collision between an American Airlines jet and a Black Hawk helicopter continues to be under investigation. The preliminary FAA report leaked to the New York Times suggests that staffing was off at the air traffic control tower at Reagan National. Joining me now is Eli Lake. Eli is with the Free Press. He is also the host of the Breaking History podcast, longtime friend of mine and of the program, and like me has probably been in and out of National 1,000 times and horrified by this. Eli, before we go to the hostage release, I want people to know about Breaking History, your thoughts on the coverage of this last night. There were ghouls out on X trying to score political points last night.
I mean, let's find out what happened first and foremost. It's a terrible, terrible thing, and there will be plenty of time for blame to go around. But I just think the speculation at this point as to who to blame for something this catastrophic is, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's ghoulish.
All right, let me move on to another ghoulish thing. There was a hostage release today in Israel, and I was hopeful until I saw what they actually did. There were 4 different terrorist groups involved in the release of either the octogenarian or the 2 women soldiers. And it looked like the mob was going to take him. What do you think this does to the Israeli soul? I just think it dooms phase 2.
Oh, it dooms phase 2. I think there's a deeper point. I want to go back to a comment that Mike Huckabee, the nominee to be the ambassador to Israel, said. He was asked what his views on a Palestinian state was. And this is before we've seen these propaganda videos of these releases. And he said there was a Palestinian state. It's called Gaza, and that didn't work out very well. I don't think people quite understand that this kind of gloating, this kind of psychological propaganda is going to delay any talk of a 2-state solution for another generation. I think October 7th did that already. But, for the Palestinians then to turn around and claim to be victims when it's, yes, this is Hamas, but it's not just Hamas. As we saw on October 7th, there was another wave that came in that invaded those kibbutzim, and they were just, the people of Gaza. And that is the result of generations of a kind of brainwashing agenda that I think makes it impossible for any sane person to talk about a Palestinian state, which I think you and I have been accustomed to hearing talk about that since the 1990s through the Oslo process. And we have to recognize that this is over for the time being. You cannot give that kind of situation, that society that produces these kinds of propagandist plays, a state. You can't expect any country to want to be a neighbor to that. So
not only
at
that,
this point,
I'm going to go further. Yeah. I think Netanyahu and the government will have to resume the war after as many hostages as they deem possible to release have been released. Because I don't know Joe Truzman. He's over at FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Yeah. I trust that he's good because he's at FDD. He writes, 4 different terrorist organizations participated in the chaotic transfer of Arbel Yehud today. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Resistance Committee, the Palestinian Mujahideen movement. All right, I don't know how Israel can not go back to war as soon as they've decided they've got as many hostages out as possible. Do you?
Listen, the one thing I do think is important is that you have to take a look at the larger regional picture. There's a window right now in Iran to take out their nuclear sites when the state itself no longer has a viable air defense because of Israel, and they no longer have the proxy ability to rain rockets the way they could before through Hezbollah. So in that respect, that I think is the biggest piece on the chessboard. And my hope is that Donald Trump will do what Joe Biden was unwilling to do, which is to provide Israel with whatever kind of support it needs to get this job done, because that's not just in Israel's interest. That's in America's interest. That's in Europe's interest. That is in the interest of the moderate Sunni Gulf kingdoms. I mean, this is what needs to be done. And there is a window now. I don't know how long that's going to be open. And I think that that's got to be the number one priority. But at the end of the day, Hamas cannot exist if Israel is going to live in security. So that has to also be kind of on the agenda.
Now, the chief terrorist of the terrorists is Ayatollah Khamenei. And there are reports he's dialed in all of his proxies and said, let's lay low for a while, for the reason you just discussed, Eli. And I don't know what's going to happen. I think Secretary Hegseth, Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Walls are very good on Israel. I think President Trump's very good on Israel. I have heard concerns about Mr. Witkoff, whom I don't know anything about, and I've heard concerns about some lower-level appointees at the Department of Defense. What are those concerns?
Well, the concern with Mr. Witkoff is he's made some inopportune comments. He has praised Qatar. Qatar is the one Gulf state that has decided to cast their lot with the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood and has been basically a supporter of Hamas, and at the same time acting as if they're the negotiator. So they're the arsonist and the firefighter in that regard. And Witkoff has said that they were wonderful. And also what Witkoff did is when he went over to negotiate this hostage deal in the 3 phases, he basically took kind of what was on the shelf from Antony Blinken and the Biden administration and then said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And I think that, that deal is sort of in and of itself bad for Israel. So those are the knocks against Witkoff. I'm concerned that there is sort of an undercurrent within the administration that is trying to put people at the middle levels. I wrote about this earlier this week, that are of this kind of, neo-libertarian, they call themselves the restrainers. And while you're not going to have them at the senior levels, the cabinet level, as like a Rubio or a Hegseth or a Steve Walsh, I agree with you that they're terrific. Mike Waltz is terrific. They are there in an implementing kind of phase, and we could see problems. I mean, you're a longtime Washingtonian. These are the deputy assistant secretaries of defense, people like that. So I'm worried that this view, what might be, sort of associated maybe with a Tucker Carlson worldview, is going to have its sort of say and could potentially shape things. And I have to say that I think Tulsi Gabbard, as the director of national intelligence, if she gets through, we'll see. I saw her hearing today. Certainly doesn't come from the side of the fence of a Rubio or a Walls either.
But when you hear a Tom Cotton, who is as good a friend as Israel has ever had, say, agreed. I know Tulsi. I don't know Tulsi Gabbard. I've never had on the show. She's a Democrat. Yeah. Why would I know her? Democrats are welcome here, but most of those who accept, like Angus King or Josh Shapiro or Ro Khanna, are really smart, and they're looking to engage. I'm not worried, Eli. In fact, I'm worried about you overreacting a little bit, because if I'm going to run a big tent administration like Reagan did, I want every part of the party in. I want to hear them, and I want to decide what's best. And I don't think they're isolationists, and I don't think you're a neocon warmonger. All the labels. Fair. It's never true, right? Everyone is much more complicated than they're made out to be.
Yes, but I think in the case of Tulsi Gabbard, there are certain things that I admire about Tulsi Gabbard. I have certainly moved my views of the FBI and the national intelligence community and the larger national security state just by covering Russiagate and covering, the Hunter Biden stuff. So there's reason we need reform, and maybe she will be part of that. But this is also somebody, who in, I think it's 2017, decided to travel to Syria and had a meeting with Bashar al-Assad.
Very disturbing. Very disturbing.
Yes. And so things like that, I'm just saying, are question of judgment. And I think that you would disagree with her past praise of Edward Snowden. I'm all for, as a journalist, I'm all for leaks, but that was like a traitor. That was a mega leak. Right, there you go. So I'm just saying that it's not the end of the world. I agree with you that it doesn't mean that I don't have, high hopes, I guess you could say, for a Trump administration, particularly in compared to what we just had with the Biden administration. So you and I are in agreement on that. I just feel as a journalist, it is important to sort of note these trends, and I'm not, it's not coming out of my head. I'm getting it from people who are alarmed at this point, but we'll see.
Now, I hope. How long do I have you for, Eli? Can I keep you through the break and to the end of the year? Okay. Yeah. Because I want to make sure we talk. In fact, let's talk about it right now. The new Breaking History podcast. They've broken you out of the Free Press Honestly podcast where you used to live. You show up occasionally on the Commentary podcast. Now you got your own. So what is Breaking History? We got 30 seconds. We'll go to break. We'll come back after break and expand on it.
It's my effort to offer an intelligent but accessible 40-minute or so podcast that explains something that's in the news right now through the lens of an historical event, a movement, a personality. And we can talk a little bit more after the break.
Okay, great. Get ready to tell me
Yeah.
about the latest episode to illustrate this.
Absolutely.
I've known Eli for 15 or 20 years, one of the best reporters in Washington, D.C. He's now at the Free Press, one of the best new media. I'm new old media. Old new media is what I am. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. As I often say, there are three buckets of media. There's legacy media, and by that I mean ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. Used to be the LA Times, but it's a shell. Then there's old new media, which includes talk radio as pioneered by Rush, and I've been doing it since 1990, and the Fox News Channel, which launched in 1996, old new media. And now there's new media, stuff like the Free Press, which I subscribe to, and one of its contributors, Eli Lake, who's a longtime journalist who used to work in legacy media, now he's in new media, old new media, and new media with this podcast, Breaking History. Tell us about Breaking History, Eli.
Well, as I said, it is an effort to try to provide historical context to the news. So we usually lead with a news event, and then we try to kind of do a dive into something that has happened in the past that helps illuminate it. So our debut episode was about Trump's inauguration, as I see it, a great American populist moment, and he ran as a populist. And so I did a show that looked at the first populist president, Andrew Jackson, who, as I'm sure appreciate, is a fascinating and extremely consequential figure in American history. And while there are certainly differences between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump, there are so many similarities, and that's really the joy of doing the research for the show. I love reading history, and I try to sort of bring that my enthusiasm for the subject to the listener. And to do it in a way that isn't intimidating and doesn't require you to sort of put aside 3 hours or 5 hours or something like that. It's just an easy 35 to 40 minute show that hopefully you come out of it and you're saying, wow, I hadn't thought of that before, and makes you want more.
Interesting. Everything I know about or remember about Andrew Jackson is probably from John Meacham's American Lion.
Yes,
and the Jackson portrait is back in the Oval, so it's certainly timely. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Did you touch on William Jennings Bryan because he's really one of our first populists, or do you just do one of them?
Well, I lead it with a discussion of what populism is, which I'm relying on the historian Michael Kazin's book for this, which was like now, oh my God, almost 30 years old. In which, but Kazin kind of came up with this theory that populism was more of a kind of mood. It was almost a political grammar. It was whenever you decided to sort of frame your movement as the people versus an elite of some kind. I didn't get into William Jennings Bryan because it's a bit complicated to explain. I had a draft of it where I did, but I talk about Huey Long, I talk about George Wallace, I talk about Ross Perot in the beginning to kind of give a sense that we've always had a kind of populist energy in America. And that while too much populism can be a very bad thing, Hugh, I think that populism in moderation is an excellent thing, because what it does is it accommodates a very natural kind of American spirit to say, I don't like the way these elites are running things, without entirely disrupting the system. And that is a remarkable thing for a country that was founded in revolution. So I say that populism in the end is a little bit like an escape valve. And I think that the election of Donald Trump, if you think about the alternative, might be getting us out of that cycle where both parties challenge the legitimacy of elections, and in some ways is kind of let's give the critics their due. And that is, I think, a healthy thing, because I don't think that it's going to signal a 500-year reign of Trumpism or MAGA. No, that's not how America works. And Jackson had 12 good years, his own 2 terms, and then Martin Van Buren. And then the Whigs got it together, and they won an election. So that's...
Eli, I want to even go back further. Our framers, particularly Hamilton, knew Plutarch. Yeah. The first populist is Gaius Marius. The first anti-populist is Sulla, and then Caesar's a
actually,
populist.
I would argue the first populist is Tiberius Gracchus.
You're right, but I'm not. That's really outside of my scope. I know Plutarch, and there are 2 Gracchi, so they're both populists.
Right.
But they were aware of this, right? They knew the countryside versus the capital was a real deal. Yep. I think they planned for it.
I think they did. It is the genius of our founders, and that's the part of it which I like about populism. The bad part about populism is that sometimes you will get figures who will be prone to conspiracy theories, and they will not be able to discern between kind of corrupted institutions and real expertise, and that could be a
Oh,
problem in a
interesting.
country. So it's not all good or bad, but I'm inclined to think that there is something really beneficial, because I do think if Trump had lost the election, then or he was announced to have lost the election, he would have a very legitimate grievance to say, you waged these ridiculous lawfare against me. I was gagged by Juan Merchan in the Alvin Bragg suit, which was meritless, and you warped the justice system in a way to sort of become a partisan weapon. And in my view, that would have been a fairly legitimate point, and who knows where we would have been, and it really could have been a much bigger crisis. So in some ways, I think it was very good for the country that Trump won.
Last question in this regard. Kash Patel has
Yeah.
been assailed today. I don't know Kash Patel, but
Yeah.
Robert O'Brien, who is one of my closest friends, says he's very smart, he's very loyal, very patriotic, very good at his job, and he's been assailed as almost a threat, hysterically, by Amy Klobuchar at one point. I mean, do you worry about? I don't worry about Kash Patel. There are laws. There are courts. The FBI is not neutral. The FBI management has gone to the left and part of the weaponization, and they need reform, but not radical demolition.
I think the FBI needs reform, and my hope is that Kash Patel will surround himself with the people who can accomplish reform effectively. Because I think if he leaves himself open and takes wild swings as the FBI director, if he gets through, and I think he will get through, by the way, well then, he will actually be depriving the institution of the reform it does desperately need, which unfortunately Chris Wray has not been able to accomplish after the Comey era, which I think really was pretty
Yes.
bad. And I have to say that I have not watched that hearing, so I want to reserve judgment. But when I wrote about it before, I do think that there were, including the names of people in the appendix of his book, was intemperate. I don't necessarily think that would be I don't know, an enemies list, but I do think it left himself open, and I think it would be you can't have an FBI director who is announcing a kind of his personal grudges. But again, this is one of the things I love about history, Hugh. We've been there before. Bobby Kennedy had a personal grudge against Jimmy Hoffa, and he warped the IRS and the Justice Department and created his own shadow FBI just to go after Hoffa and his associates.
And I
So
like to point out to
you know,
people, my first boss of big consequence, Richard Nixon, I was out in San Clemente
Yeah.
in 1970. He was afraid of Hoover. I mean,
Oh yeah,
there's a
he
there's
was.
a problem with the bureau. If Nixon is afraid of a guy, that means that guy's got too much power. And
Yeah,
Comey had too much power.
another time we should talk about when I'm increasingly of the view that there's like this alternative theory of Watergate, which is actually it was a kind of deep state coup. I'm not entirely on board with that, but I think there's a lot more merit to that.
Go watch
than
Jeff
people say.
Shepard's documentary at
Yeah.
salemnow.com. Jeff is the
Yeah.
expert on Watergate, and I think you're right. We'll do that another time. I'm going to enjoy Breaking History, Eli. Keep coming back. I'll talk to you at least monthly, and I'll start listening to Breaking History
Thank you.
on the Long Trundles. Breaking History is part of the Free Press.